Developed for the Game Boy Advance and released in the year 2003, Castlevania Aria of Sorrow is perhaps one of my favorite games of all time. Simply looking at these nostalgia-ridden screens is enough to bring a tear to my eye. Reminds me of simpler times, back when dreams were still alive and well, and joy was no more than a cartridge and a 240 pixel screen away. The game stuck with me for one simple reason. Not only was it one of the first Castlevanias I've ever played, the gateway to a world of dozens of screens, hundreds of enemies, and plenty of secrets to find at my disposal to enjoy at my own pace, but it also had a particularly enjoyable mechanic that I 100% lost hours upon hours with: the soul collecting system, giving me access to the powers of my enemies as well as the ability to build my own Soma Cruz and personalize my own experience. The fact that every single enemy had a soul only increased the joy it brought me to finally be able to tread on uncharted territory just so I could farm whatever new enemy I saw and harvest their abilities for myself. I look back at this game very fondly, not because of the lineage of the franchise, or the particular work of a very talented video game producer. It is because playing through it was fun. Running through rooms, collecting treasure and powers, exploring the sealed-away castle of Dracula himself. It made the experience stick with me for long after I had finished it. Of course, back then not much was necessary to give me a good time, and looking back on it now, that's the only thing this game really is. Fun as hell to play. Now, you may be wondering why I brought up How about we play a game where we get really sad instead? Ender Lilies is not particularly a Metroidvania as much as a Souls-like. With your usual dodge roll, pattern recognition, non-linear storytelling in a dark and ruined world you're encouraged to explore and discover as you grow your strength, uncover ancient lore, powerful relics, and build toward a climax that's not entirely for the sake of plot, as much as it is to bring closure to the player character. The main focus of the gameplay lying in overcoming its challenges and staying true to yourself until the end. Only Ender Lily seems to have gotten its aspiration from God of War instead. Forget gothic, dark fantasy, this one is overwhelmingly bleak. Enough to stand out in any shot, from the dozens of corpses littering the city streets to the actual spirits of the damned you make use of and have to cut down in order to explore the world, as areas in this game are riddled with dangerous undead, as well as constantly bombarding you with the visages of lamenting corpses and tragedies without end. The setting takes a turn from the epic and grandiose and cinematic to the mundane. It touches on the end of times a little less particularly than every title mentioned thus far, showing the player the life of people in the thick of catastrophe from the eyes of someone still trying to grasp the falling strings, casting every scene to this heavy, serene music, almost as if the soundtrack itself refuses to acknowledge what you're made to uncover, holding on to this vain hope that if you ignore it, maybe it'll go away. This game, as a Souls-like, takes a step back from the self-actualizing and deeply personal nature of Dark Souls to, instead, use the setting to place narrative at the forefront, putting the player from the start into a story that had a beginning, is at its midway point and will have an ending. There is not much player input into how this narrative unfolds, and the experience, mechanics, and gameplay interactions notwithstanding, remains the same throughout the game, as well as parallel and repeated playthroughs. It's a game you're meant to complete once. As such, it tries to tell as hard-hitting a story as possible. The first few frames introduce us to the main character, and through which eyes we see the story unfold. A little girl that appears to have some kind of power of great significance, as well as the main gameplay mechanic we'll be using from now on. Namely, the ability to use the powers of purified spirits to our aid. The Umbral Knight, our first and most reliable spirit, is, in this regard, the most important addition to our arsenal, as well as our protector and companion, providing much needed emotional support to me particularly given the state the world is in. The mechanic also highlights the main focus of the game, which is to tell its story, since it gives a very powerful reason to seek out and interact with as much of the world as possible in order to find more and more spirits to purify and grow your options in battle. And those involve a boss fight, a little snippet of lore giving form and meaning to the otherwise basically armament, as well as usually a cutscene serving to further the plot. Gameplay is fairly standard for Souls-like. You have your dodge roll, which is incidentally the fastest way to move on ground in this game, as well as limited healing and a comparatively strapped health bar. At some point you gain the ability to parry moves as well as spirits who do the same, but counter-attacking after blocking damage, and the play is fairly involved as far as inputs go. You're made to watch out for attacks and punish fast and hard almost all the time, and since enemies don't stagger from damage, you gotta keep on your toes. Though that aspect of play is what brings this game down in my opinion, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Metroidvanias, in my opinion, benefit a lot from their setting. Rather, it's one of the only consistent things that make the genre worth playing. And this one does it very well all the way through, to rising from the bowels of a nearly destroyed church made to simmer in the ruins and rotten corpses, made to eventually face off against a massive monster, then wade into the town, perpetually drenched in rain, uncovering the details little by little as you fight for your dear life all the way across the land to the bowels of the earth. It's a well-realized world with much story to uncover, and after playing whatever that was for over 30 hours, it's really a breath of fresh air to finally play a game that respects itself and tells you a story it truly believes in, even if it is some of the most edgy stuff I've ever seen. Which brings me to the first issue of this game, and many parts of the puzzle don't really fit together well enough. For example, the level design usually leaves a lot to be desired, especially since it draws many inspirations from Metroidvanias, such as constant backtracking to areas you've been before in order to access new ones, as well as riddling rooms with secrets and item pickups. It can come with a little friction, having to engage with a game this much when such design basically amounts to a corridor containing a couple platforms and a few dozen enemies copy-pasted throughout the entire game, only to be rewarded in the end with a dead child instead of, I don't know, a shotgun. You're supposed to be the only person on the planet able to deal with the enemies you face against, yet every time you leave the room, all enemies respawn, making that facet of gameplay completely alien to the plot. In that way, Ender Lilies brings a deeply narrative experience in spite of player expression. Like, yeah, you have options. You can target at enemies' posture bar to trigger a stagger and effectively stunlock them, but that doesn't extend to bosses, and at the core, it is an entirely linear playthrough, both in gameplay and player experience. And I must say, it is profoundly asshole-ish in its design. By the midway point, I was chafing. One person can only endure so much friction, but the thing is, as the world begins to burn, overrun with immortal undead, and when you're the only one that can do anything about it, it is expectable to experience a certain amount of pushback. I just wished it wouldn't be so on the nose about it. Every single inch of this game seems built to resist progression, and it shows on the player count. The game loses nearly 60% of players up until a little over the midway point. From then, it's a little less acute of a drop, but by the end only 30% of players stick around. And I'm torn on the issue. On one hand, yeah, I get it. But beyond the grit, is a heap of genuine effort and honestly well-realized content that over 70% of people miss out on because the first area of the game is extremely filtering, as well as the first major boss. And it's only downhill from here. I'm unsure if it's by design, necessity, or incidents, yet regardless of which, still making it feel like gameplay exists as a contrivance to the plot, expecting the player to really try for what essentially is a few words of text and a dead body. For how much I love the story, there's loads of other things I dislike more by the second about this game. For example, enemy AI sucks balls and ass. To illustrate my point, Guardian Silva here. Her moveset provides her with a lot of mobility that she can use to close in, attack, and pull out for a highly mobile and dynamic fight. Now, think with me here. In this situation, what will this boss do? Of course, she'll use her frontal dash to close in the distance and try to hit the player with her hammer. Easy. After that, she can either follow it up with another hammer swing or use another move to create distance and shoot projectiles. Bosses in this game have 3 phases though, and those phases allow them more moves to make the fight more complex. All standard business, but when Silva gets allowed 5 more moves to create distance and not enough hammer swings, the AI starts to spam the moves it has the most of instead. What the fuck is this idiot even doing? She used her create distance move to get close to me. It's like someone picking up an online fighter for the first time and choosing the most complex character to play even though they have no idea what the moves even are. Only this time, the boss is allowed to make hundreds of mistakes while you can only afford a few. And it doesn't extend only to bosses either. Normal enemies also suffer from the same condition, though instead of making them skittish and nearly unpredictable, normal enemies are relentless and nearly berserk, creating an environment that just feels so incredibly awkward to traverse, as it either relegates the player to run past everything and never actually interact with what's on screen, or to methodically cut down every single thing on screen, treating every fight as a life or death scenario that's, unsurprisingly, boring as hell and incredibly stressful to play, given the normal gameplay loop isn't complex enough or solid enough to carry so much combat at once. Worse yet, as a Metroidvania, part of the combat of the game is positioning your character properly in order to keep them in range of your swings and you away from their hitboxes, else you'll take contact damage. Excuse me, but can we stop and recognize just how unfun contact damage is from a gameplay perspective? And the hitboxes. Oh, the hitboxes! Oh, like this one where the sword swipe hits me within 1 or 2 frames of activity? Do not get me started on the hitboxes. I'm sorry, but does this make any sense to you?
What a unique perspective you have!
You can find and collect a whole lot of spirits in this game, and they all contextualize a little bit of this world every time you find them. However, once you find another, shinier and more reliable spirit, the last ones end up forgotten in a menu almost 100% of the time, and they might as well not exist at all during boss fights. It doesn't help that you can only carry 6 at a time, or 3 a hand, in between 2 loadouts you switch between. Consider that 4, since the first space in both of those will usually hold the Umbro Knight, since without him, you have no basic attack. You cannot switch between loadouts during active frames, and you can only cancel recovery frames with a dodge or a parry. I'm not here to play Guilty Gear, bro. Give me a break. And by far the most egregious aspect of this game, the lead-filled cherry at the top of this asbestos-lined cake, is boss design. Oh my god. I have never seen a game with as many bullshit boss mechanics like this one. Actually, I don't even think I can say that with a full heart, because the bosses in this game don't have mechanics. They're merely walls you're meant to bash your head against for hours on end until you either manage to find the correct combination of moves to perform for several minutes without getting hit, or you drop the title. You can see here how I made a stupid mistake, that is, failing to realize that the boss is about to do his burst spikes from the ground move and not his close range down slam move, because at this point, my brain has turned to mush. It's an incredibly difficult game to beat, and not nearly half of it is earned, from bullshit map segments filled with monsters specifically meant to block you, to little help in between checkpoints, to ambrosially evil area design. Specifically speaking, this area where you're supposed to explore two sides of a spire to eventually find a lever in each side that'll open the way so you can take this massive elevator down to the boss. And every single inch of this place is laced with enemies that two-shot you. You're gated from the true ending if you don't have enough health, by the way, so you better get exploring. It's not a smooth experience, and it's definitely not a game you can pick up to explore in your downtime. You know, like a Metroidvania. I'm not even sure it's a game that's enjoyable for a die-hard Souls fan. You know the ones. On account of how little player freedom there is, you're basically stuck to the path of most resistance all the way through, and it's exhausting. I know the only reason I stuck with it was because I was invested in the story, and I wanted to get to the end of it. I wanted to know what was up with Lily, who the Umbral Knight was, what happened with the last priestess, and in truth, I did get my answers, but not a single one of those made it worth my effort. Over 70% of people do not reach the end. This is a clear case of gameplay and narrative working against each other, as on one hand you have clearly written, purposely built story that reaches its conclusion perfectly, and on the other you have demented gameplay that demands mechanical mastery to even advance at all, that actively shunts players from seeing it through by themselves, and even if they make it, even if they put up with a challenge, the payoff at the end is hardly worth the effort, to the point where it feels like a waste of time from beginning to end. This is what the end boss looks like, and you have to be defecating rainbows if you think that's okay. Castlevania was never one to overstep its boundaries. It knew what it was meant to accomplish and set out to do just that, a smooth and fulfilling experience from beginning to end. And you might even come out to say, skill issue, grow up, and in truth it is, but I think I'm not the only one to say that there's a time and a place for everything, and Ender Lilies takes inspiration from all the wrong places. Honestly, I'd much rather this game be a visual novel, or that it dropped the Souls-like tag at all to focus more on the story, because it's truly inspiring, and I'm so mad that I can't recommend this to people. In any case, Castlevania Aria of Sorrow, good game, go pick up the DBA, play it right now.